Welcome to World True Crime, where we delve into the shadows of human nature and the chilling tales that lurk behind the facades of seemingly perfect lives. In this episode, we explore a gripping story that begins in the quiet suburban haven of Crestwood, a place where the perfect veneer of life can conceal the darkest secrets. It was the summer of 2014, in the quiet streets of Crestwood, an idyllic suburban neighborhood where every house looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine, lived Mark and Jane Anderson. To the outside world, the Andersons embodied everything a perfect family should be. Attractive, successful, and seemingly content with the life they had built together. Their house, nestled among manicured lawns and picket fences, was a reflection of their stable and prosperous life. To their friends and neighbors, Mark and Jane were the golden couple, the kind of people everyone wanted to be. Mark, the husband and father, was a respected architect in the community. He had designed many of the homes in the area, earning a reputation as a talented and hardworking man. His career flourished, and he took pride in the work he did for their neighborhood, helping shape the very community they lived in. He was well liked by his peers and known for his calm and easygoing nature. His devotion to his family was evident to anyone who knew him, always making time for his two children despite his busy career. On weekends, Mark could often be seen coaching his son's soccer team or riding bikes with his daughter, giving off the image of the perfect family man. Jane, on the other hand, was the embodiment of a dedicated wife and mother. She had once worked in public relations before choosing to stay home and raise their children full-time. Jane was deeply involved in the local school's PTA and was always at the forefront of organizing community events, charity drives, and neighborhood gatherings. She was the type of woman who knew everyone's name, dropped by with baked goods for new neighbors, and never missed a chance to support the local bake sale. Jane and Mark appeared to have it all. The beautiful home, the close-knit circle of friends, and a seemingly flawless marriage. But beneath this perfect facade, cracks were beginning to show. The pressures of keeping up the image of perfection weighed heavily on Jane. Over the years, she began to feel stifled by the predictable routine of suburban life. Though she loved her children, Jane felt increasingly disconnected from her old self, and she longed for excitement, for something more than being seen as just a wife and mother. Mark, deeply focused on his work and providing for the family, failed to notice the growing distance between them. To him, everything seemed fine. The occasional argument or disagreement was nothing out of the ordinary in a marriage, or so he thought. Yet, as time went on, Jane's feelings of restlessness intensified. She began to crave attention and affection that Mark, absorbed in his career and responsibilities, unknowingly failed to provide. The cracks in their marriage widened, but no one outside the Anderson household could see it. To the neighborhood, they were still the picture of perfection. But the secrets hidden behind their front door would soon unravel, and their seemingly perfect life was about to take a dark and tragic turn, a turn no one in Crestwood could have imagined. Next door to the Andersons lived Tom Mitchell, a man whose life seemed just as settled and picturesque as the neighborhood itself. Tom had moved into Crestwood a few years after the Andersons, and he quickly became known as a friendly, approachable presence in the community. He lived with his wife, Sarah, and their young daughter in a home that, like most in the area, was well kept and pristine. On the surface, Tom and Sarah appeared to have a happy, harmonious family life, much like their neighbors, the Andersons. Tom worked as a construction manager, and like Mark, he was often busy with his job. He took pride in his work, although it didn't carry the same prestige or glamour as Mark's career in architecture. While Mark was designing the buildings, Tom was the one ensuring they were built. A hands-on, hard-working man who enjoyed the simplicity and satisfaction of a job well done. Tom's work often demanded long hours, but when he was home, he made sure to spend time with his daughter, taking her to the park or helping her with her school projects. To anyone watching, he seemed to be a dedicated father and husband. But there was something about Tom that set him apart from the other men in the neighborhood. He had a certain charm, a casual confidence that made him easy to talk to. He was the kind of guy who could strike up a conversation with anyone, at the grocery store, at neighborhood barbecues, or just during a chance encounter on the street. People liked Tom because he had a way of making them feel comfortable, like they had known him for years, even if they had just met. Beneath his laid-back exterior, however, there was a restlessness to Tom that few people noticed. His marriage to Sarah, though seemingly stable, had grown strained over the years. Like many couples in the neighborhood, the daily grind of work, bills, and raising a child had taken its toll. The spark that had once defined Tom and Sarah's relationship had long since dimmed. They still loved each other, but their connection had become more about maintaining their family life than about passion or excitement. Tom often found himself longing for something more, though he kept these feelings hidden from those around him. It was during this time of discontent that Tom and Jane Anderson began to cross paths more frequently. It started innocently enough: small talk over the fence, conversations at neighborhood gatherings, the occasional friendly wave as they passed each other on the street. But there was an undeniable chemistry between them, a spark that both of them felt but didn't acknowledge at first. Tom, feeling neglected in his own marriage, was drawn to Jane's warmth and attentiveness. She seemed to understand him in a way that Sarah no longer did. As time went on, their conversations became longer, more intimate. Jane found herself opening up to Tom about her frustrations with her own life, and Tom, in turn, shared his dissatisfaction with his marriage. What began as a harmless connection between neighbors was about to evolve into something far more dangerous, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. The affair between Jane Anderson and Tom Mitchell didn't happen overnight. It began with a series of subtle, almost innocent moments, the kind of small interactions that seemed harmless at first, but slowly built into something much more. It started with the casual conversations. At first, they would just talk over the fence between their homes. Jane, watering the flowers in her garden, would exchange pleasantries with Tom as he stepped outside to grab the morning paper. Their chats were lighthearted. A few words about the weather, their children, or neighborhood gossip. But over time, those brief conversations stretched longer, becoming more personal. Tom would linger just a bit longer, Jane would laugh a little louder, and their eye contact held for a second too long. Soon, those encounters became more frequent. If Jane saw Tom outside, she would find an excuse to head to the yard. And Tom, who once went unnoticed as just another neighbor, now seemed to be around every time she stepped outside. Their conversations turned from light banter to more intimate topics: frustrations with their marriages, the struggles of parenting, and the growing dissatisfaction with their lives. They confided in each other, feeling understood in a way they hadn't felt in years. The first time Jane and Tom met outside of their homes was by chance, or at least, that's how it felt at the time. Jane had gone to the grocery store in the early evening, and Tom happened to be there too. When they bumped into each other in the frozen foods aisle, it felt like a coincidence, but the way they smiled at each other said otherwise. They chatted for a while, discussing mundane things like dinner plans, but beneath the surface, there was a growing tension. As they said goodbye in the parking lot, Tom made a comment, something about how nice it was to talk without being interrupted. Jane smiled, knowing exactly what he meant. After that, their meetings became more intentional. They would run into each other at the coffee shop or the park where their children played, always acting as if it was just by chance. But each encounter became more charged with unspoken feelings. At neighborhood events, their partners by their sides, they would exchange fleeting glances across the room, their eyes meeting for just a moment too long before they looked away. It was the kind of tension that no one else seemed to notice, but it was undeniable between the two of them. Then came the texts. At first, they were simple, innocent messages. Jane sent Tom a text asking for his help fixing her garden gate, knowing full well Mark could do it. Tom replied immediately, eager to assist. From there, their conversations moved from casual neighborhood matters to more personal discussions. They began texting each other late at night after their spouses had gone to bed. These late-night conversations were filled with confessions, complaints about their marriages, their frustrations with life, and subtle flirtations that gradually became bolder. Tom would text something like, "You look nice today," and Jane would respond with, "I noticed you looking." They both knew they were crossing a line, but neither was willing to stop. The excitement of the secret was too intoxicating. Soon, their texts became more frequent, more intimate. They would send each other messages throughout the day. Small, secretive exchanges that kept the thrill alive. When their partners were in the same room, they would glance at their phones, making sure not to smile too much or look too suspicious. They developed a language of coded messages, emojis, short phrases, and inside jokes that only they could understand. It gave them a sense of power, a secret connection that no one else was privy to. Eventually, the thrill of the secret texts wasn't enough. Tom suggested they meet in person, somewhere out of the neighborhood. At first, Jane hesitated, knowing that meeting privately would push their flirtation into something more serious. But the temptation was too strong. They arranged to meet at a small cafe just outside of town, a place where they wouldn't run into anyone they knew. When they sat down at the table, the tension between them was palpable. For the first time, they were alone together, without the pretense of a neighborhood event or a coincidental meeting. From that moment, their affair escalated. They began meeting regularly, sometimes for coffee, other times in more secluded places where they could be alone. They would steal away for an hour during the day, making excuses to their spouses. Jane would tell Mark she was going to run errands, while Tom would tell Sarah he had a late meeting at work. Each secret meeting only intensified the danger and excitement of their relationship. Even in the midst of their secret affair, they maintained the appearance of normalcy in the neighborhood. At neighborhood barbecues or community events, they would barely acknowledge each other, but their brief eye contact was loaded with meaning. The thrill of sneaking around, the hidden texts, the stolen moments, it all became part of the rush, pulling them deeper into their web of deception. What began as a harmless connection between neighbors had transformed into a dangerous affair. Neither Jane nor Tom seemed able to stop, even though they both knew that the path they were on could only lead to disaster. Their once perfect suburban lives were now teetering on the edge, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Mark Anderson had always trusted his wife, Jane. They had been together for years, built a life and a family, and although their marriage had its ups and downs like any relationship, he never doubted her loyalty. But recently, things had begun to feel different. At first, it was subtle. Little things that were easy to brush off as coincidence or stress. Jane had always been a bit distracted, but lately, it was as if she was completely elsewhere, even when they were in the same room. Mark noticed that Jane had become more secretive with her phone. She had always been open about her messages and social media, but now she would quickly put her phone face down when he walked into the room, or would take it with her into the bathroom. Something she never used to do. She started receiving late-night messages, which she would dismiss as notifications from the neighborhood group chat or a friend catching up. But Mark could see that her eyes would light up with a mix of excitement and nervousness each time her phone buzzed. Then came the absences. Jane would tell him she needed to run errands, but the trips seemed to take longer than usual. She'd say she was going to the grocery store or out for a quick coffee with a friend, but she'd be gone for hours. When Mark asked where she had been, Jane's answers were vague, often brushing him off or getting defensive. It was unlike her to be so evasive, and it left Mark with a growing sense of unease. The once easy conversations between them had turned tense. Jane no longer wanted to engage in the deep talks they used to have late at night. When Mark tried to bring up their relationship or express concern about how distant she seemed, Jane would either change the subject or respond with frustration. It wasn't just emotional distance. It was as if she was actively avoiding him. The intimacy between them, both physical and emotional, had faded into something distant and strained. Mark began to suspect that something was seriously wrong. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Jane was just stressed or going through a personal crisis. But the signs were too many to ignore. One night, as Jane slept, he glanced at her phone, which she had forgotten to take with her to bed. It was locked, but the notifications on the screen caught his eye. Several missed messages from an unknown number. His stomach dropped. It was at this point that Mark began to put the pieces together. He recalled the times he had seen Jane talking to their neighbor, Tom, at neighborhood events. At the time, he thought nothing of it. Tom was friendly, and they all interacted often. But now, in the context of Jane's increasing secrecy, those interactions seemed suspicious. The way Jane's face would light up when Tom was around, the subtle exchanges between them. It all started to make sense in a way Mark didn't want to admit. He wasn't sure what the truth was, but his gut told him that Jane was hiding something. And it was only a matter of time before he discovered what it was. The tension between Mark and Jane had reached a breaking point. Mark could no longer ignore the late-night messages, the long absences, or the emotional distance that had grown between them. One evening, after Jane returned home unusually late from yet another errand, Mark decided he couldn't hold his suspicions in any longer. As Jane walked into the living room, Mark was waiting, his expression grim. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Jane, we need to talk," he said, his voice thick with frustration. She sensed the seriousness in his tone and hesitated, but sat down across from him, trying to appear calm. Mark didn't mince words. "What's going on with you? You've been distant? Secretive? I can't shake the feeling that something's not right. Are you having an affair?" Jane's eyes widened, a mix of shock and fear crossing her face. For a moment she was silent, caught off guard by the directness of the question. Then, with a sharp breath, she shook her head. "No, Mark, I'm not having an affair. How could you even think that?" But Mark wasn't convinced. "You've been different, Jane. You're always on your phone, disappearing for hours without explanation. You barely talk to me anymore. It feels like you're hiding something, and I need to know the truth." Jane's voice rose defensively, her face flushing with anger. "I'm not hiding anything. Just because I'm not glued to your side every second doesn't mean I'm cheating on you. I've been stressed, okay? I needed some space, but that doesn't mean I'm having an affair." The argument quickly escalated, with Mark pressing Jane for answers, and Jane growing increasingly defensive. Each time Mark pointed out her suspicious behavior, Jane shot back, accusing him of being paranoid and controlling. The more he pushed, the more she denied, and the gap between them widened even further. Meanwhile, next door, Tom's wife Sarah was beginning to have her own suspicions. Sarah had noticed Tom's sudden shift in behavior. He had started coming home later than usual, claiming he had to stay late for work, but there were no additional paychecks or signs of extra projects. Tom had also become more protective of his phone, something that immediately set off alarm bells for Sarah, who had never had reason to doubt him before. Sarah had seen the way Tom and Jane interacted at neighborhood events, exchanging quick glances and lingering a little too long in conversation. At first, she brushed it off as innocent neighborly friendliness. But as Tom grew more distant and secretive, those harmless interactions now seemed suspicious in hindsight. She recalled moments when Tom and Jane's eyes met, as if sharing a private joke. It wasn't just coincidence. There was something more going on. One night, after Tom had once again returned late without a convincing explanation, Sarah confronted him. Though not as direct as Mark, Sarah voiced her concerns, asking Tom if something was going on between him and Jane. Tom, caught off guard, dismissed her suspicions, claiming she was imagining things. But like Mark, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Both marriages were now on the edge of collapse, with trust shattered and suspicions growing. While Jane and Tom continued to deny everything, the truth was becoming harder to hide. The carefully crafted facade of suburban normalcy was beginning to crumble, and it was only a matter of time before the secrets they were hiding came to light. The weight of Mark's suspicions had become unbearable. His confrontations with Jane had gone nowhere, leaving him feeling more frustrated and betrayed with each passing day. He couldn't stand the thought of his wife and neighbor possibly having an affair, and the uncertainty gnawed at him constantly. Finally, Mark made a decision. If Jane wouldn't admit to anything, he would confront Tom directly. It was a cool evening when Mark saw Tom outside, casually mowing his lawn, as if nothing was wrong. His anger surged, and before he could stop himself, Mark stormed across the yard, his fists clenched. Tom noticed him approaching, but the look of fury on Mark's face made it clear this wasn't a friendly visit. "Tom," Mark said, his voice shaking with barely contained rage, "we need to talk. Now." Tom turned off the mower, wiping sweat from his brow. He could sense the tension immediately, but he tried to play it cool. What's going on, Mark? You know exactly what's going on, Mark snapped, stepping closer. I know something's happening between you and Jane. Don't try to deny it. Tom's face paled for a brief moment, but he quickly composed himself. You're out of your mind, man. There's nothing going on. But Mark wasn't backing down. Don't lie to me. I've seen the way you look at her, the way she acts around you. I know something's been going on behind my back, and I'm not letting it slide. As the words hung in the air, both men's tempers flared. Tom's calm demeanor crumbled, and he stepped forward, his own anger rising. You don't know what you're talking about. Nothing happened, Mark. You're being paranoid. Mark's patience snapped. He shoved Tom hard, sending him stumbling backward. You think I'm stupid? You think I haven't noticed the late-night texts, the secretive meetings? I trusted you. Tom regained his balance, his face flushed with anger now. He pushed back. The two men now squared off, inches apart. You've got no proof of anything, Mark. You're just looking for someone to blame because your marriage is falling apart. The words hit Mark like a slap to the face, and before he could stop himself, he swung at Tom. His fist connected with Tom's jaw, and the sound of the impact echoed in the quiet evening air. Tom staggered but quickly retaliated, throwing a punch of his own. The two men were now locked in a violent brawl, fists flying as years of friendship disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Neighbors began to gather at the sight of the fight, drawn by the commotion. Mark and Tom wrestled on the ground, both fueled by anger and betrayal, until finally they were pulled apart by onlookers. Both men were bloodied and bruised, breathing heavily, their faces twisted with rage. As they were separated, Mark's voice broke through the chaos. I'll find out the truth, Tom. This isn't over. Tom, clutching his jaw, didn't respond. He knew in that moment that their lives and their neighborhood would never be the same again. The violent confrontation had set off a chain of events that would soon expose the secrets they had worked so hard to hide. The confrontation had spiraled out of control, fueled by rage, betrayal, and suspicion. Mark had stormed into Tom's house late one night, demanding answers. Jane, sensing that things had gone too far, rushed after him, pleading for him to stop. But Mark was beyond reason, blinded by fury. Inside the dimly lit living room, the argument exploded into violence. Mark threw the first punch, sending Tom crashing into the coffee table. Glass shattered, and the room filled with the sound of furniture scraping and heavy breathing. Tom, dazed but furious, grabbed a broken piece of glass, his desperation driving him to defend himself. Jane screamed, begging them both to stop, but neither man was listening. Mark lunged again, his anger all-consuming, and in a flash of panic, Tom swung the shard of glass wildly. It all happened too fast. The glass struck Mark in the side, slicing deep into his flesh. He staggered backward, clutching his wound, his eyes wide with shock. Blood poured from his side, pooling on the floor as he collapsed. The room fell deathly silent, except for the sound of Jane's horrified sobs. She rushed to Mark's side, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Mark's body went limp, his eyes staring lifelessly into the void. Jane, covered in his blood, cradled his head in her lap, her tears falling onto his face. The weight of what had happened crushed her, the reality of her choices sinking in. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, it had all led to this. In that moment, surrounded by the broken remnants of their lives, Jane was left alone, drowning in a pool of regret. The police arrived at the scene quickly, summoned by frantic neighbors who heard the fight. Mark's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood as officers secured the area, roping off the house in yellow tape. Jane, still trembling and covered in blood, sat on the front steps in shock, barely able to speak. Tom stood nearby, his hands shaking, knowing his life had just shattered. In the cold, sterile light of the police station, Jane and Tom were separated into different interrogation rooms. The detectives wasted no time. Jane, pale and distraught, was pressed for details. "Tell us what happened," the detective demanded, his voice steady but firm. Jane's voice cracked as she recounted the argument, the escalating violence, and her helplessness to stop it. She avoided eye contact, her guilt weighing on every word. In the next room, Tom's interrogation was more aggressive. "Why did you kill him?" the detective asked. "Tom, eyes hollow, tried to explain it was self-defense. His words tumbled out in a desperate plea, but the detective wasn't buying it. They pressed him on the affair, knowing it was the catalyst for everything. Both Jane and Tom's lives now lay in the hands of the law, their fates uncertain. Tom Mitchell was arrested on charges of murder. Despite his claims of self-defense, the evidence and the volatile circumstances of the confrontation made his case difficult. As he was led away in handcuffs, his face was a mixture of fear and resignation. The weight of his actions had become all too real, and the future seemed bleak. Meanwhile, Jane Anderson faced her own devastating reality. The police investigation and Tom's arrest had exposed her affair, laying bare the reasons behind the violent altercation. The media coverage painted her as a central figure in the tragic events, and the community's sympathy shifted from her to the family of the deceased. Jane's world crumbled as she faced the repercussions of her choices. Her marriage was irrevocably shattered. Her children were left without their father, and she was left to grapple with the fallout of her decisions. As Tom awaited his trial, and Jane confronted her fractured life, both were forced to come to terms with the catastrophic consequences of their actions. The once perfect facade of their suburban lives was gone, replaced by a harsh new reality filled with regret and sorrow. The end of this tragic story found both Jane and Tom grappling with their shattered lives in the aftermath of the murder. Tom Mitchell's trial was a media spectacle. The details of his violent altercation with Mark Anderson laid bare for the public. His defense claimed it was an act of self-defense, but the affair and the heated argument painted him as a man driven to violence by jealousy and desperation. Tom was ultimately convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The court's decision brought little solace. Tom's life was now marked by the stigma of his crime and the years he would spend behind bars. For Jane Anderson, the fallout was equally devastating. The exposure of her affair and its role in the tragedy led to her public disgrace. Friends and neighbors turned away, and the once close-knit community seemed to view her as the cause of the violence. Her children were left without a father, and she faced the daunting task of raising them alone while coping with the guilt and shame that haunted her. Jane's marriage to Mark was irreparably broken, and she found herself isolated, struggling to rebuild her life from the wreckage. In the end, Jane and Tom were left with their remorse and the irreversible damage caused by their choices. Their lives, once filled with promise and normalcy, had been upended by a series of decisions driven by dissatisfaction and deceit. The community that once admired them was now left with a grim reminder of the consequences of betrayal and violence. Thank you for joining us on World True Crime. We hope this episode has shed light on the shadows that often lie beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. The tale of Crestwood serves as a haunting reminder that even the most idyllic facades can conceal the darkest secrets. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We delve into the intricate and unsettling world of true crime, bringing you closer to the real stories behind the headlines. Your support helps us continue to explore these gripping narratives and share them with you. Share your thoughts and comments below, and let us know which stories you'd like us to cover next. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.